Today's episode is sponsored by the free-to-play game War Thunder, which I will use to visualize the history and the use of the Messerschmitt Bf during World War II. If aircraft fascinate you as much as me, or perhaps you are a fan of those targets some people like to call tanks or ships, War Thunder has everything you need. Get started with War Thunder by using the link in the description below to sign up for free and receive a sign-up bonus, including as an exclusive Military Aviation History channel logo. The logo can also be obtained by all of you that have already previously signed up to War Thunder by following the link in the description. More info on War Thunder later on in the video. Hey, it's Chris from Military Aviation History and welcome to another entry in my In Defense Of series. This will be familiar to loyal viewers, but if you're new here, in this series I take a look at some of the more popularly maligned aircraft from the past. I talk about why that plane existed, what purpose it was supposed to fulfill, and how it was used in the end. And the purpose of this series is not really to change anyone's opinion on the aircraft, but it's really to open up a discussion and perhaps also leave some of the more older, outdated interpretations in the historiography behind and really shed new light on an aircraft and see whether that reputation that it has really holds up or not. And if it doesn't, what the contextual reasons for that are. So in today's video, of course, as you have seen in the title, I will be talking about the Messerschmitt Bf. The first thing I want to talk about are, of course, the specifications and the anticipated purpose of the aircraft, the 110. Then I want to talk about the expectations, the advantages, and of course the employment of the aircraft. And then I'm going to hand it over to you to tell me what you think. So let's get started. Now, the failure of the Bf during the Battle of Britain, of course, dominates the reputation of this aircraft. You cannot go into a discussion saying Bf without somebody bringing up the Battle of Britain. However, that battle actually tells us very little about the aircraft because, well, throw any sort of heavy fighter into a similar engagement like the Battle of Britain without giving it a real performance differential compared to the single-seat, single-engine fighters that it faces, well, it is going to fail. Against the RAF's modern fighter planes, the Zerstörer had insufficient chances of survival. Yet the Bf was not a bad aircraft. Compared to similar twin-engine fighters of the Western Air Forces, the Bf proved to at least equal, if not superior. Because the 110's performance during this battle is so widely known, and because there are 1,000,001 videos on that, I won't delve into it here. Because why repeat what you already know? We've got so much other stuff to go through. The 110's development started in 1934, that is 1 year before the Luftwaffe was unmasked. And as a concept, it's not entirely new. You can find something like it, so a plane that carried a lot of firepower and it had a lot of range and it was supposed to support a bomber force. You can find that concept even in the First World War. However, what was new is that the aircraft was to benefit from sort of the aeronautical and technology revolution that was happening in the 1930s. Yeah, you have that switch from the bi to the monoplane, you get more powerful engines as well, you're starting to really push the envelope in terms of what is possible, and the Zerstörer concept was to make full advantage of these developments. Yet when it came to choosing between the Bf and its competitors, the 110 was chosen not because it fulfilled the specifications, but because the other options were worse. And that's not a great way to start out. And it showed that the aeronautical developments of the time were unable to deliver what was actually required, or rather, what was specified. But what was specified? Well, the 110's tasks in the Luftwaffe were straightforward. Quoting here directly from one of the German documents from 1939. The development within the conduct of aerial warfare has made it necessary to create a heavily armed fighter which is able to fly into enemy territory. This is a multi-engine aircraft of long range and due to this able to have strong weaponry, multiple machine guns, cannons and bombs, good blind flying and radio equipment as well as a second cruise station for the radio, rear gunner. The tasks of the Zerstörer are independent combat and destruction of enemy air force, combat in cooperation with operations of the Luftwaffe, especially the bomber units. A further breakdown makes it clear how these tasks were supposed to be fulfilled. For targets in the air, the following was given. There was units that were taking off or landing, bomber units that were en route to friendly territory, weakened bomber units on their way back, and then fighters and reconnaissance aircraft were found, and then also flight schools. On the ground, the targets were aerodromes, maintenance bases, and resupply bases. Of course, beyond this, a series of special tasks could also be given if necessary. Operations against rail, vehicle and naval targets, gas and fuel supplies of all types, and troop assemblies. Supporting paratrooper and airborne units. Protecting and enforcing reconnaissance, especially long-range reconnaissance. In exceptional cases, employment of the Zerstörer in support of the fighters in the air defense, and employment in point defense is to be rejected by principle. The last point is perhaps the most interesting, as 110s would eventually be used in all of these roles, but here they are only being considered in special circumstances. But of course, for the Luftwaffe and for parts of the Luftwaffe in the run-up to the Second World War and then also at the beginning of the Second World War, the Zerstörer concept itself was pushed forward very aggressively, more so than in many other countries. And that meant, of course, that Germany did invest a lot of time, effort, resources and manpower into this concept, and that didn't really pay off initially. The Zerstörer was seen as the fighter aircraft of the future. In the industry and military structures, the single-seat and single-engine fighter played a minor role. The attack and thus the decision of the war was to be carried and enforced through the bombers and Zerstörer. As before any war, concepts are developed and they get tried and tested during the conflict. Some turn out to be right, others turn out to be wrong. Just think about the late 1930s and the various aircraft concepts that actually existed back then. Here, an interesting quote from 1939 on exactly this conundrum in reference to fighter armament is quite interesting. The opinions of foreign sources vary regarding the employments of the Zerstörer's weaponry. One side places an emphasis on fixed forward weapons that fire high explosive rounds at long range, whereas the other side proposes installing flexible weapons to attack the enemy by flying along his side. These methods will change in future conflicts and, just like during the Great War, depend on the behavior and weaponry of the enemy. In short, you don't really know if something is going to work until you use it in real combat conditions, right? And the Bf 110, well, it fell short of the two main tasks that it was developed for. And that was, of course, long-range missions, because it didn't have the fuel capacity to either have that range or the endurance. And also to establish air superiority, it didn't really have that performance differential that was required compared to single-engine, single-seat fighters. So in that sense, yeah, it failed. But there was recognition of this in the Luftwaffe even before World War II started. In discussions on the Me-110 destroyer aircraft, it was admitted that this aircraft was considered a misdesign because of its inadequate penetration depth. It was supposed to be able to fly a distance of 2,500 kilometers, which was equivalent to a penetration depth of 1,000 kilometers. At best, the Me-110C achieved a penetration depth of 450 kilometers. If about half an hour was allowed for air combat over the target, the penetration depth was reduced to 350 kilometers. As early as the summer of 1938, the General Staff had therefore called for the Zerstörer with a range capacity of 2,500 kilometers, corresponding to a penetration depth of 1,000 kilometers, and for an additional fuel reserve for a combat flight time of about half an hour over the target. The problem with the 110 is that as a project it starts in 1934. And back then, this concept of a twin-engine, heavily armed fighter was very appealing. And it was so appealing, and in fact it stayed appealing for many, many years. This is why countries like Britain, Japan, United States, Russia, France all invested time into such concepts, time, effort and resources into such concepts. That even though nowadays we look at aircraft like the 110 and we say, well, that didn't really work out. If you look at it from the perspective of the time, it does start making sense. And I'm not just talking about some of the aspects that I've really discussed, like the technological shift that was happening at the time with more powerful engines, new airframe designs and so on and so forth. But you also have to sort of look at the perspective and the vision that these forces had and how they're going to be fighting once war breaks out. And that's where we have to talk about doctrine. For the Luftwaffe, this is where it really starts getting interesting, because if you look at the 110 and then you look at Luftwaffe doctrine, which focused on, in the opening stages of an operation, knocking out the enemy air force, things start really making sense. Yeah, go home if you're not home just yet. If you are home, go to your files, and you of course have Luftwaffe Regulation 16. This is my copy from the archive lying around somewhere in your house. And look in there and you'll start noticing that yes, the Luftwaffe wants to knock out the enemy air force in the opening stages of an operation. So what they need is an aircraft that can attack at longer ranges the enemy air force and at the same time also defend the friendly bombers from attacking things like aerodromes and so on and so forth in order to help knocking out that enemy air force. And if you look at it from that perspective, rather than in hindsight of how these operations actually turn out, because of course they're going to be different than what was anticipated, but if you look at it from that perspective, a plane like the 110, well, it really starts making sense. Of course, that being said, there were problems. As mentioned in the introduction, I won't talk much about one versus one dogfights, because in a vacuum, without mitigating circumstances, a heavy fighter will always be at a disadvantage. What I want to talk about, however, is range. A quick check at the range of aircraft of the time will make it obvious why the 110 did not fulfill the specifications that were required by the Zerstörer concept. So let's have a look at some of these range figures here, and as always, these figures are a bit give and take due to the influence of speed, height, weather, and so on and so forth. And remember, this is also still before drop tanks became standard or longer range escort fighters were available. Of course, there was an attempt to increase the range through drop tanks also on the 110. However, while these drop tanks did increase the range, at that point, of course, the poor dogfighting capability of the aircraft was still an issue. In fact, it could even be worse. Now, the internal standard loadout of the Bf 110 had around about 1,200 liters of fuel. There were also early attempts with conformal-ish fuel tanks that added roughly 1,000 liters on top of that. But that didn't do the plane any favors in a fight or in its look, and they saw little use. A few different types of drop tanks were also considered to hang off the wings. So you had the 400 liter tanks and you also had 300 liter tanks. Those appear to be the most common. Now this is where I run into a bit of a problem. I have pretty much the entire collection of the 110's flight manuals, at least what I can get my hands on. Yet I can't find the range figures in those manuals. Instead, the different manuals refer to an additional document that I don't have, but maybe I am missing something. I do have one document that might be it, but it is based on the early D and E version. As a side note, this once again shows that even with the most basic information, you can quickly run into problems validating information through primary sources. Anyway, based on this document, the max range of the internal fuel load is 885 kilometers, with an additional maximum of 445 kilometers with 400 liter drop tanks. I assume this means both drop tanks, as even though the singular tense is used in the table, it refers to both in the description, and because by some quick estimation it does actually check out that way. This appears to be only a small gain, but that actually makes sense. I also have another document for the later 110 models. This is the G2, which shows somewhat similar ranges, so you can see that nothing has changed that much. You can get a full range here by adding both figures together. This is of course once again in kilometers. The additional range for drop tanks is not given. Of course, these values are ideal values without any sort of real life variance. Remember, external fuel tanks, they don't just add weight or decrease performance, they also significantly increase drag. And in fact, as a quick rule of thumb, this is not very precise, but as a quick rule of thumb, you can always calculate it this way. Roughly half of the capacity of a fuel tank that is slung under an aircraft, that capacity is only used in order to compensate for the fact that the fuel tank is used in the first place. And only the remaining half is used in order to extend the range of the aircraft. Now the equation is of course different per aircraft, and the equation is completely different also for conformal fuel tanks, but you start seeing the picture, right? You can only add so much range with additional fuel loaded in things that are hanging off the aircraft and that are not mounted internally. By the way, one bit of trivia on the Bf 110 is that it was one of the first planes to use an early type of self-sealing fuel tank. Germany's twin-engine Bf 110 was equipped with self-sealing fuel tanks before the war began. One valuable item Britain sent to the United States was a fuel tank from a crashed Messerschmitt Bf 110. From this, the American engineers deduced that the Germans had undertaken extensive pre-war research on fuel tank construction. So now that we have talked about the concept of the 110, its intended tasks, as well as that the most obvious problems that it had, Let's talk about how it was actually used. The first thing we have to talk about now is of course the second and then later on third crew station that was added to the 110, because while this is something that is less emphasized nowadays, it does offer some distinct advantages. The second crewman operated the radio while the pilot was flying. The 110 was equipped with various radio sets offering air-to-air and air-to-ground communication. Equally, the 110 carried a Peilgerät from the start, that's a directional finding radio set, which single-engine fighters only got later. This gave it a navigational tool helping with bad weather and nighttime flying, or flying across long distances of open water, for example. While later on fighters would also receive this, at the beginning of the war it was a big bonus. If you compare, for example, the relative ease the Luftwaffe had in making the 110 operational for night flying compared with, well, trying their luck with Focke-Wulf 190s during Wilde Sau missions, well, just watch this video, then you'll get what I mean. While the single MG-15 in the rear, that was firing a single 7.92mm round, was little better really than throwing pretzels at enemy planes, the rearward observation was its weight worth in gold from a defensive standpoint. And of course, the second crew member could also be used for general observation during the mission as well. And then later on, radar sets would also be introduced for night fighting. These were once again very heavy, cumbersome sets that required a crewman to operate. And in the last model of the 110, the G4, a third crew member could operate these. In the early Bf 110 variants, the second crew member could also reload the forward-facing 20mm MGFF. Watch this video for more information on that. The same then also applies to the final models of the aircraft using the same cannons with schräge Musik. Equally, the Germans tended to emphasize the comradeship between crewmen, but this is hard to quantify really. But I can imagine that, especially on long-range missions or during night fighting, knowing there's somebody with you there does give you some sort of comfort. A second pair of eyes and a second pair of hands in the 110 were crucial in allowing it to carry the radio equipment and the navigational equipment that it carried in the end, and as well as that it also helped with things like air and ground spotting and later on with radar as well. Given the technical limitations at the time, it would not have possible to carry all this equipment and specifically operate all this equipment without that second and later on also third crew member. So now let's talk about the employment of the 110s, and a big thank you here also to today's sponsor War Thunder for all the tailor-made footage of the 110s in action that I provided for this video. Of course, this is when I arrive at the main problem with explaining the use of the 110 with the Luftwaffe, because the Luftwaffe's use of this aircraft doesn't really follow a certain logic, right? We have this overall transition from a fighter platform over to a fighter bomber and then going into a night fighter. But there is, throughout the war, a lot of overlap in that, and also depends on the theater, whether it's the Western Front, the Eastern Front, the Mediterranean, Africa, and so on. And actually, I found a file in the archives, in the German military archives from 1943, that shows this really well. Until now, the Zerstörer had essentially the same tasks as the Schlachtflieger with a focus on the taktischer Raum. Depending on the theater, the tasks had a different emphasis. In the East it was combating ground targets. In Africa, in the beginning also ground targets, but then a transition was made due to the enemy air superiority to escort missions, and at times the air defense of the Italian airspace. From now to the foreseeable future, the main task of the Zerstörer is air defense of the Reich as a heavy fighter. I will now briefly talk about the fighter bomber and then the night fighter use. One of the first major attempts was that the Bf 110 was to be refitted for ground attack into a fighter bomber. This was already a very early development. The final C version was the Bf 110 C7 fighter bomber. The fact that in April 1940 Bf 110s were already equipped with the ETC 500 bomb racks indicates that as early as mid-1939 there were plans to use these machines as fighter bombers, suggesting that the C7 was not a reaction to experience gained during the Battle of Britain. Again, this development shows how Germany was really at pains of finding a role for this aircraft because, well, first of all, when we start with the C model as a fighter platform, it doesn't have the range. Then comes the D model that has theoretically the range, but now as a fighter is even less suited to combat as the C platform. And then they think about, well, let's push that into a ground attacker then. But of course, as a ground attacker, the D platform is absolutely useless with that belly tank, so you have to take it away again. And that's how the development then kickstarts into the E model, the F model, and then later on the G models. And you can really start seeing how there's overlaps in these developments between trying to fit it into a fighter bomber role, but then also later on as a night fighter. It also became obvious that the 110 was not a good close air support aircraft. It was considered vulnerable due to its size and liquid-cooled engines and thus relegated to interdiction. Quoting directly out of one instructional Luftwaffe lecture here, the Bf 110 was used as a Schlachtflieger, especially in the taktische Raum, to combat stockpiles, streets, locomotives, fighters and columns. On the Gefechtsfeld, only an exception. Safety line for bomb drops due to difficulty in finding correct target. Special training and exceptional experience are required. However, in its role it lacked support and was also vulnerable, as one experience report from the African theater shows. The British and American fighters used in the African theater and in Malta were far superior to the Bf 110 in terms of maneuverability, climbing ability and speed. Low-level attacks without direct strong fighter protection on their own led to high losses. As a fighter bomber, the 110 had the carrying capacity to have some effect. It had good loadout options, and although range was limited, it could fulfill that task to some degree. However, this also largely depended on the context of the individual missions, and in discussions on further developing this plane into a more dedicated ground attack platform, it was agreed even by mid-1942 that this was not really worth it. That said, even by late 1943, the main tasks of the Zerstörer were still considered to be interdiction and escort duties. This was soon to change, however, as air defense became way more important. As you might remember from the start of this video where I talked about the intended use of the 110 from that original Luftwaffe file, right? The Bf 110 was considered only to be used in air defense, in sort of close range air defense, in very exceptional cases. If it was to engage bombers, it was supposed to do this from a very long distance and then of course keep the skies clear for single engine fighters at sort of doing more the point defense on over friendly territory, right? And you did have some of these engagements even in 1939 over the North Sea, for example. Some of the early bomber raids that the RAF was flying were intercepted by 110s, for example, over the North Sea. But really, the 110 only becomes important to Germany as an air defense asset around about 1944. With the increasing strength of bomber formations and the presence of escort fighters, Bf 110s were increasingly pushed into nighttime air defense, although the first attempts occurred way earlier than that. In July 1940, the Luftwaffe's first real night fighter command, Erste Nachtjagddivision, was created to direct the newly formed Nachtjagdgeschwader 1. The latter was initially comprised of two Gruppen with Bf 110C twin-engine fighters. The Bf 110 had not yet suffered heavy losses in the Battle of Britain and its reputation was still intact. The lack of radar detection equipment made it difficult for night fighter crews to intercept British bombers. As the war progressed, so too did the refits of the 110 shift this plane into such a role. For longer night flights, the night fighter were to be equipped with modern equipment during the winter period 1941-1942. Due to the high navigational requirements and radio communication, the Me-110 night fighter was already equipped with a second man for these purposes. The first dedicated night fighter was the F4 model and then the G4 as the final production model of the 110. This aircraft had been changed to account for some of the new requirements. First off, you of course have the radar. This required the addition of the radar set behind the pilot, operated by the radar operator. And then the antenna in front of the aircraft acted as both the transmitter and the receiver. Then the Schräge Musik was added and mounted around the initial observer station on either side of the defensive MG-81Z. These cannons were the same old MG-FF-Ms, but as 20mm cannons fire at mainly right angles into the unprotected undersides of Allied bombers, it was able to inflict serious damage in very short bursts. The raid on the 17th to 18th of August 1943 on Peenemünde is commonly regarded as the first operational combat trial of Schräge Musik. This was the first night on which the Germans used their new Schräge Musik weapons. These were twin upward firing cannons fitted in the cockpit of the Me-110s. Two Schräge Musik aircraft found the bomber stream flying home from Peenemünde and are believed to have shot down 6 of the bombers lost on the raid. Schräge Musik allowed Bf-110s to approach bombers from below and therefore often unseen. Positioning themselves 2 to 3 to 400 meters under a bomber, it gave them an easy shot at the engine and the wing fuel tanks. The 110 did relatively well as a night fighter, but the requirements of those sort of operations had already led to the development of a more specialized aircraft. That was of course the Heinkel HE-219. But until that was ready, alternatives of course had to be found, and the 110 was one of them, as were refitted bomber models as well. Before D-Day, the Luftwaffe leadership had decided to phase out the Bf-110 G4 and convert Staffeln to the newly improved Ju-88 G6 night fighter, and this process was accelerated in September. The number of Bf-110 equipped Nachtjagdgruppen dropped from 16 in January 1944 to 10 in December 1944 and just 5 by April 1945, but the aircraft remained in the fight to the finish. Now, how do we rate the 110? As with any platform that comes out of the mid-1930s, I really caution against comparing it to sort of the zenith of aviation designs during the Second World War. So aircraft that were in their prime during sort of the 1943 to 1945 period, because that's really not a fair comparison. The 110 showed its age during this time. It has shown its age before that already. But if we do not, first of all, compare it to those platforms that you cannot really compare it to, you can see that the Luftwaffe still considered the 110 to be an asset, a placeholder in parts for more specialized platforms that were going to be folded into the Luftwaffe's arsenal once they were ready, although it of course didn't come to that. Let's take a look, for example, at some of the other planes that had twin-engine designs that are generally very fondly remembered nowadays. What do we have? The P-38 Lightning, we have the de Havilland Mosquito, and then we can also perhaps have a discussion about aircraft like the Heinkel HE-219, right? Development of these aircraft started roughly 3 to 5 years after the 110, and that shows you just how much of a difference that can make. Because the comparable twin-engine designs that we have here, well, they're pretty much the peak of where you could bring a twin-engine design. But those years, those 3 to 5 years, they make all the difference to the P-38, to the de Havilland Mosquito, as well as the Heinkel HE-219 in the specific tasks that these aircraft were supposed to fulfill. And then if you still take those aircraft and then you put them up against a single-seat, single-engine fighter, the P-38, the de Havilland Mosquito, as well as the Heinkel HE-219 are going to be at a severe disadvantage. Now, contextually speaking, of course, that could be overcome. So, for example, in the Pacific with the P-38 Lightnings, their service record was relatively good there, also because they employed a lot of aircraft over there, and that range factor also played in their advantage. With the de Havilland Mosquito, of course, the high fast intrusions that they were flying, the Germans didn't really have any countermeasures against that, so they didn't really have something actually to put up a fight against the Mosquitoes. So obviously they're going to do well because nothing really fires back until very late in the war. And then with a night fighter like the Heinkel 219, which was more specialized than the 110, of course it's going to fulfill that role a lot better. But again, if we talk about these sort of comparisons, you have to factor in the context of the development of these aircraft as well as the context of the operational use. And I would say that if you would take a twin-engine fighter of the same sort of age as the 110 and you would put it, for example, into something like the Battle of Britain in 1940, it would have done just as poorly, never mind who designed it. The 110 here went full circle, and that shows how flexible the machine was, but it also shows that the Luftwaffe was really at pains of trying to find a role for this aircraft. They tried everything, in the end night fighting stuck. Also because the contextual disadvantages that the aircraft had, for example, in combat against single-seat, single-engine fighters, really weren't a worry during night fighting because, yeah, it wouldn't meet single-engine, single-seat fighter. It would at the end meet some anti-night fighting intruder missions being flown, for example, by Mozzies, but that was really just a small period during the war. And it really didn't have to worry about that in the end. But the 110, if you look at the concept, its origins, you also have to admit, well, nobody could have foreseen this in the mid-1930s. And so it's no surprise that something like the 110 wasn't really designed for night fighting, and considering that, it did relatively well in that role indeed. The 110 certainly did not fulfill its intended role. But that's not that rare. It finds itself in that sense accompanied by many other plane designs, many of whom had initially been unsuccessful and somehow turned it around. But while we also look at that, we also have to acknowledge that through the problems that the Germans had with the development of the Messerschmitt Me 210 and 410 that were in part supposed to substitute really the 110, and then of course also the development of the specialized Heinkel HE 219, that the 110 itself was never fully replaced either. And having said all that, now you can of course experience flying the 110, the 410, as well as the Heinkel HE 219 in War Thunder. It is completely free to play and features more than 2,000 aircraft, helicopters, as well as targets like tanks and ships. Not only will you find a wide selection of Bf-110s and other heavy fighters from the Second World War era, like for example the P-38 Lightning or the de Havilland Mosquito, but you will be treated to a fantastic selection of air power goodness from the 1930s all the way into the late Cold War. Of course, you can also drive tanks and ships if you prefer to be a target, but you know where you will find me. Yeah, that's right, up high, fast, taking names and chewing sauerkraut. And I'm fresh out of sauerkraut. War Thunder is constantly evolving with new tanks, ships, and of course most importantly of all, aircraft, being added continuously in updates, and the game features full cross-platform integration between PC, PlayStation and Xbox. So sign up for free by following the link in the description below and get a sign-up bonus with a free premium vehicle, a 3 days booster, and the exclusive Military Aviation History channel logo as a decal in-game. And now of course is the time where I want to push the question over to you. What do you think of the 110? Did this video give you any more insights into the aircraft? Have you learned something new? Have you discovered a new appreciation of this aircraft? What is your opinion of it? Do you still think that it is, well, not a very good aircraft platform in itself, that its service during World War II really shows that? Whatever you think about the platform, put it down below in the comment section as well. And I want to have a special thank you here, of course, also to all the channel supporters, channel members over on Patreon, and of course here on YouTube as well, for supporting this channel. If you're interested in supporting this sort of content, check out Patreon or channel memberships. You'll get perks like, for example, early access to videos just like this one, or as well as that we have a fantastic Discord server with a really great community there. We have bi-monthly meetings as well where we talk about things like aviation. So check that out if you're interested, and as always I wish all of you a great day and see you in the sky.